Welcome to Mormon Land, a podcast all about news and culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Senior Managing Editor Dave Noyce, and I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. Before we start, here's a quick ask. If you have not already, we invite you to go to patreon.com, where for as little as $3 a month, you can access all of the Tribune's faith coverage, podcast transcripts, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormon Land. Now for today's show. The recently completed 194th Annual General Conference of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints may merit no more than a mere mention in the history books of Mormonism. There were no theological breakthroughs, no major policy changes, no sweeping shakeups among the top echelons. But the sessions did feature significant speeches, memorable moments, and notable nuances. A British church leader delivered his debut conference sermon as an apostle. A longtime apostle returned to the conference pulpit after an extended absence. A black general authority rose in the ranks to a historic level. Speakers publicly addressed the private wearing of so-called temple garments by the faithful, and the church's aging senior leadership, led by a prophet president inching ever closer to the century mark, made conspicuous accommodations to conference procedures. Here to discuss those developments and more from the weekend gathering are Emily Jensen, web editor for Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, and Patrick Mason, head of Mormon history and culture at Utah State University. Emily and Patrick, welcome back to Mormon Land.
Happy to be here.
Dave. Okay, well, this is a question for both of you. Emily, you can start. Just briefly, what were your initial impressions or takeaways from conference?
Briefly, I have a lot of notes.
We'll get to those, I'm sure.
From conference. I feel like if you were to summarize this conference, as we're going to go forward in the next 6 months studying it, it would be very heavily focused on temple and very specifically focused on covenants. In fact, I saw some funny tweets as people were listening about if they were doing a bingo game or maybe drinking milk or something like that for every word. And if they had picked covenant, they would definitely be in trouble. So the conference text went up last night, and I was actually very curious to see how many times covenant was said in conference. And so I took a little time and I looked and I found all the mentions. Dave, do you have a guess how many times?
Oh man, I have no idea. Did it hit triple figures?
It did. It was in the hundreds.
Oh man.
227 times.
Wow. Followed right by Think Celestial, right?
Yeah, that was another one that I thought about checking to see because I thought littered throughout the talks, but nowhere near as many times as Covenant.
Yes. So Patrick, what about you?
Well, I'd completely echo that. I mean, it's unmistakable, right? What the overall theme was, and it's not entirely clear to what degree there's any kind of coordination. My understanding is most speakers choose what they speak about, but it also probably indicates the kinds of messages that are happening, that the kinds of conversations that are happening within church headquarters over the previous few weeks and months. So even if people aren't assigned topics, I think this probably indicates this is what has the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 have been talking about in their trainings and other meetings and conversations with people. So yeah, this was this was a very memorable conference in the sense of it's unmistakable what the major themes were.
Mm-hmm. So let's dive into some particulars now that I set up some of them, but let's talk about Patrick Kieran. He was already known and had given a couple of speeches that were notable before and noticed by a lot of people. But for many members, this was their first exposure to him as an apostle. And he was kind of known for giving dynamic, compassionate, messages. So, Patrick, let's start with you. Give us your first take on his first speech as an apostle.
Yeah, well, I'm an Elder Kieran fan, and I don't think he certainly didn't disappoint for me. I thought it was a terrific talk. I thought it was a really powerful articulation of Latter-day Saint theology in terms of, he really leaned into this notion of God's infinite love and an infinite atonement of Jesus Christ, that God doesn't put up roadblocks in front of people, and in fact is in the business of getting people through roadblocks. And he just delivers it, I think, with warmth, with authenticity, with a deep sense of Christian discipleship. I mean, for me personally, everybody's going to have their favorites based on what resonates with them. But for me, that was a talk that resonated deeply.
Yeah. Emily, what about you?
I mean, I saw so many people online as soon as he finished speaking, just being so grateful for his words, so happy that he talked so beautifully about the infiniteness of God's love. Some of the memorable lines were starting to already be quoted. The idea that, the great plan of happiness is for happiness now as well as into the eternities. I mean, he just was such a beautiful, positive, faithful, lovely talk. And I also loved it when I heard it.
Yeah, it did seem to be more of a opening and broader view of, and less right. No, this is some doors are closed because of choices people might make, right? I mean, didn't that come across?
Completely. But it also there was talks that spoke to that opposite idea as well. And that was a little jarring to hear. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely true. That there's always been a tension within Latter-day Saint theology. There's tensions within broader Christian theology, right, between faith and works, and God's grace versus human effort. And we saw those tensions. We heard those tensions over the weekend. And so Elder Kieran represented and voiced kind of one very authentic part of Latter-day Saint theology. We heard other articulations that talked more about the need for worthiness and keeping covenants and so forth. Some of the people that I talked with after conference said that they were really moved by Elder Kieran's talk about the fact that God doesn't put up roadblocks, but they said sometimes it feels like there are certain aspects of the church where there are roadblocks, including in the very Temple Recommend interviews, to get to the temples that were spoken of so much within General Conference. So, I think there's a way to reconcile those things within Latter-day Saint theology, but I think we also have to acknowledge there is a kind of tension there. It can be a productive tension, but it's a tension nevertheless.
Okay, let's skip to Elder Holland. Members hadn't heard him at General Conference for a year and a half. And he returned and gave a very personal speech about his health struggles. Patrick, what were your impressions of that? And then Emily, you can go.
Yeah, I think this was another highlight. I mean, Elder Holland's so beloved within the church. He's been such a steady presence for so many years. He always, his talks, I think, are something to look forward to. He's just a great orator. And this was, in some ways, vintage Holland, because he is willing to be authentic and speak personally and movingly. We've seen that plenty of times in the past, but there is a sense of this is a man on a mission. He talked about that, right? He feels a kind of renewed lease on life. I mean, he's not exactly doing jumping jacks up there, right? He was in a wheelchair. I think his health is still somewhat precarious, but he. I thought it was really tender to hear him talk about his wife the way he did. I mean, that was, they clearly just had such deep affection for one another for so many decades. It was really beautiful. So I thought it was a really nice way to kick off conference.
Emily? I've loved Elder Holland's talks, and it was really gratifying to see him back up there. However, as he was speaking, and then combined with President Nelson's talking before his pre-conference tweet about how they are wearing out their lives in the service of the church. And Elder Holland also said something to the effect that, his experience with becoming so close to death, he had an experience where he now feels more urgency to work harder to do these things. And I started to feel sad a little bit and sorry for them that they have to do that, they have to wear out their lives in front of us. And I wonder if we as a church who look at these leaders and want them to, I would love to hear more from Elder Holland and Elder Nelson, but they're also wearing their lives out for us. Maybe we should start changing our minds and trying to perhaps pray for the opportunity for them to be released from their calling. Maybe with the idea that could be such a gratifying thing for their families as well. I think about their families and having to watch these men, fail and flail in front of us in such a way. It doesn't seem very kind of us.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, because it was very, very much evident on display. And even Elder Holland's talk, he talks about having maybe just more weeks and months, sometimes. And he said that before since he started to recover. But with the First Presidency all in their 90s and President Nelson, attending in person for 2 of the 5 sessions and once again delivering his address via recording. He was there at the time, but younger apostles being called upon to conduct sessions and 3 senior apostles, you mentioned one, but Nelson, Eyring, and Holland all in wheelchairs. It seems the advanced aging of the top leadership is becoming ever more apparent. And the church has been here before, of course, with this. How does this affect the church, though, in reality and maybe even in perception, Patrick?
Well, we're, so long as the current tradition and practice of seniority remains and people serving until the end of their lives, I fear that this is the loop that we're going to be stuck in. Because, with modern medical technology, we can keep bodies alive, especially, who people have been dedicated to good, clean living, right? We can keep bodies alive a really long time. One of the things I love about the church is the way that it gives place and for meaningful service among older people. They're not shunted aside once they retire. I think that's beautiful. But it's difficult. And we don't know exactly to what degree their health challenges limit the ability of the church to be dynamic, and energetic. Certainly President Nelson's tenure has been very energetic, but it does seem that it's slowed down a little bit, recently as he's gotten older. That's got to have an effect when the top tier of your leadership in such a hierarchical institution all are suffering from the ill effects of very advanced age. And so, unless they change at some point, the tradition of seniority, we're going to see more of this rather than less of it moving forward.
And it does. Am I correct? It really is a tradition and a practice and a custom more than there's some theology or doctrine, right?
Yeah, there's nothing in the Revelations that stipulates this, and so it was a practice established, very early in the church and reestablished over and over and over again. So it's deeply rooted in the tradition, but there's nothing to say it couldn't change.
Emily, you raised this, and the thought crossed my mind. Well, for instance, when Patrick Kieran was called as an apostle, suddenly his life trajectory changed.
Right.
Suddenly it's like, oh, I'm going to keep, quote, working after age 70, for instance, or whatever, since he was already a general authority. Emily, what are your thoughts on this?
Again, I think about the families, because I think, a calling like this is a family calling. It affects not only the person who is called, but his wife, as well as his children, his grandchildren, his great grandchildren, that time that is spent to this calling. Again, it's a family calling. And I feel for them. I also, not to bring politics into this, but I'm going to a little bit. We have a political system right now where we have two different presidential candidates that are being called out on their age over and over and over again, many times by members of our church, and how they are too old to be the president of the United States. And yet there seems to be a blind spot when we consider, even older president of the church, members of the, apostles.
Yeah, sort of like sustaining a 99-year-old president of the church, but being wary of a president of the United States who's younger, actually, than that, but still old. Let's turn to the covenant and the covenant path that you both mentioned. There were numerous mentions. Emily's done the math for us now, so we know, of covenants and the covenant path. When you hear those terms, what do you think they mean? And do you think all the speakers mean the same thing when they use it?
Okay, so we are going to study these words for the next 6 months. We are going to delve deep into trying to figure out theological paths through the words that the speakers spoke about. And a lot of those were about the covenant path or covenant keeping or children of the covenant. There are so many different iterations of how to clearing covenant. And so now I'm going to bring up the one talk, and the one thing that I feel like in your intro, you mentioned there weren't any theological big things. There was one talk that I feel like should be deleted from this conference because of some of the stuff. Because again, this theme is going to be on covenants and temples. And Elder Carpenter gave a talk Sunday evening where he got into the nitty-gritty of what sealings are. And in doing so, now that I can see his footnotes, he was pretty much using Elder Bruce R. McConkie and Joseph Fielding Smith as kind of his foundation for this. But in doing so, he said some really problematic things about sealings and about covenants. He, and this was brought up when he gave the talk. There was a lot of people online. As soon as they heard this, they were like, he didn't really just say this. He didn't really just mean this about sealings. And, so he talked about, the idea that if your spouse has broken their covenant, you still need to keep the sealing. Because if you break the sealing, you break your connection with our Heavenly Father, and you break the connection, kind of, it's a vertical connection with your children, and that should not be done casually or lightly. And again, that seems like bringing back in Elder Karen, a huge roadblock. That is not what I believe our church believes about covenants, about sealings, about these things in the temple. And it's wrong. Needs to be deleted, needs to be pulled.
Patrick?
Well, on that point, I think it's always interesting to look at the footnotes, and to see who people are citing. And so it is telling, if somebody's main sources theologically are going back to people like Bruce R. McConkie and Joseph Fielding Smith, now decades ago, several presidents of the church ago. And so certainly it's part of the theological record, but it also shows one of the ongoing challenges within the church is who are the authorities and who are the acceptable people to quote. That's a much bigger question. On the topic of covenants and defining them. So my wife and I got together with a bunch of college students that evening, and we talked about General Conference, and I was really struck. And this is a pretty diverse group of students and kind of different relationships with the church and with their own faith. And I was struck by the fact that most of them have really embraced the language of covenant. And they see it as a warmer and more relational term than commandments, right? Rather than keep the commandments. And so some of them, did say, oh, covenants, that's still pretty high bar too, right? And that doesn't abrogate, one of the covenants is to keep the commandments, right? So it doesn't completely eclipse that. But they really liked the relationality that's part of covenants, and that resonates with them, and I found that really interesting. So they didn't find the language of covenants off-putting; they actually found it kind of inviting in the sense of it being a person's relationship with God, and in some ways they saw that as not circumventing the church, but it's a direct relationship with God, not fully mediated by the church. Now, I think that's kind of complicated because it actually is the church that delivers all the ordinances and so forth. But at least I was just interested in the way that they found that concept to actually be quite inviting.
That's fascinating. It sort of surprises me a little bit too, I guess. I don't know. Do you think all members understand it the same way? Is it sort of meant to be understood in different ways?
I mean, this is the great thing about religion, right? Is the same term can actually be pretty fluid and pretty flexible. This is what gives it a lot of energy. And I think personally, I'm an advocate of this, right? It's what I like about being in a congregation where people share faith commitments and commitments to the community, but actually we may not all understand everything exactly the same way. We might not define it the same way. I think there's some positive energy that can come from that. There can be some negative conflicts too. But as Emily said, there's going to be lots of talks and Relief Society and Elders Quorum's lessons about this over the next 6 months. So it'll be interesting to see what those conversations are like in people's wards.
Let's talk about women speaking at conference. 3 spoke at this conference compared to 29 men, and 2 offered prayers, if my tally was correct, and I believe it is. Many women and men continue to call for this to change, frankly. It's just so noticeable. What do you think about this gender imbalance, Emily?
So this is obviously, this 3 is not enough of female representation in the church. It does not represent our church by any means. But we get into some circular logic, because what we have is General Conference is supposed to be a time where the general authorities and general officers of the church speak. And as it stands, people will say online to this, when people start talking about the gender imbalance, people online will say, well, they need to spend that time to let the general authorities speak. The time needs to be spent and all of those general authorities are men. And so we have this, we want more women to speak, but until we can somehow widen the circle of general authorities, or widen the circle of general officers. We had Sister Dennis. She was one of the speakers this conference, and she, just a couple of weeks ago had spoken in the Relief Society devotional. And then when that became, as you spoke on Mormon Land, when that blew up, she later said, we and our general church leaders are listening. And so she differentiated herself as not a general church leader. And the new general officers and general authorities, the pictures of all of them, the chart came out a week ago too. And again, there's a differentiation between the general authorities and the general officers. So these are these auxiliaries. They're not an authority. And so in conference, we're supposed to be there to listen to the general authorities. And that's what most members, I think, would say. And the women are not really a member of that body. So I don't know where to go from that, because we need more women to speak. They can pull from the boards, but it's just circular. It's just circular.
I was struck. I don't know if either of you noticed it in the kind of intro to the sessions. They said the formula had always been general authorities and officers of the church. This time I heard them say general leaders.
General leaders. Was it general or just leaders? They did say general leaders.
I thought I heard general leaders. Okay. We'd have to double check that. But yeah. But that, that reminds me of the language that's happening in missions now, right? More and more people are saying mission leaders to include the mission president and his wife. And so does that discursive change actually change anything on the ground? Does it give more space and more opportunity, more authority for women? Maybe we'll see. Or is it just a semantic change? I think people just keep asking the question. Do we need to hear? I think people recognize, okay, the first presidency and quorum of the 12 apostles, like that they're going to have a privileged place, and those are just all going to be men. So you've got 15 right there built in. But then after that, do we need to hear all these talks from members of the quorums of the 70, or can there after those 15? Can there be more parity between men and women?
Mm-hmm. And there is precedent, at least maybe not tons of examples recently, but of people who aren't general officers or have nothing to do with leadership necessarily in the church speaking at conference. Correct?
Yeah, plenty of precedent. It's been a long time.
Yeah, it has been a while.
So they've gone away from that, but there is precedent.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about, and Emily, I'll start with you. When Dale Renlund gave a talk a couple of conferences ago about Heavenly Mother, and it seems like there may have been a notable decline in the mention of Heavenly Parents and Heavenly Mother since then. Do you think that was prompted by that talk, or was it already declining? What's your view of that?
Oh, I think it was definitely prompted by that talk. Mm-hmm. But from my understanding, and I didn't specifically look at this, but I heard it twice. I heard Heavenly Parents mentioned twice in this conference, which was more than last conference. There was 0 in last conference. And so maybe the door can be opening up again, especially since we have the mention of Heavenly Parents in the Young Women's General theme. But yeah, it was disappointing, though, a little bit in this conference to not hear more about the roles of our Heavenly Parent with all the talk about covenants, covenanting to Heavenly Father, covenants and temples. And it felt very one gender kind of a thing. And not that we could talk about it very much. And I think that, when we're talking about the temple and we're talking about covenants and thinking celestial, we should be thinking about our Heavenly Parents.
So let's go to a whole different topic. It's been 2.5 years since a new temple was named in Utah. And now 2 more were named, Lehi and, West Jordan. So soon LDS temples may seem almost as ubiquitous on the landscape as chapels in Utah, or at least certainly more visible. What do you make of that and the temples in Utah? Are that many temples really needed?
I'm sure they're doing their statistical calculations in terms of usage and all those kinds of things. I mean, I don't think if you live in West Jordan, you've got 5, 6, 8 temples within a half-hour drive for you. So
you've got 2 in a neighboring city. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, So I think it is an interesting question, but there's no doubt that the church is also committed to building temples in lots of other places around the world where there's not huge presence of church membership. I mean, this is clearly going to be one of President Nelson's legacies historically, is the number of temples that he has built and announced, just like it was with President Hinckley in really changing the way we think about temples, going to small temples and things like that. And so it is pretty remarkable. I mean, I've driven through. I was just driving through Wyoming, Star Valley, Wyoming. This pretty rural area, pretty small towns, and boom, there was a temple.
Cody, right Wyoming, there. Coming. Yes, exactly. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. And so my sense is, President Nelson is creating facts on the ground, right? At a time when there's lots of talk about religion declining and so forth. Actually, the membership report was a little better this time than in the past in terms of statistics. There's a sense that, hey, we're growing, we're dynamic, we are here to stay. A temple is an anchor to show that the Latter-day Saints are here to stay in these communities.
It's interesting, Emily, and maybe you can address this too, because the religious makeup of Utah is changing, of course, as it's growing so rapidly. But the temples are going to become ever more present to people who live here, whether they're members or not. What are your thoughts about that?
first I'll give my own thoughts about the Utah temples. And then I saw a lot of reactions to the temples internationally. So my own thoughts about the Utah temples as being a Utah person, I think there's so many of them. And it makes me wonder if we have a history of using temples in times of need, like the full 24 hours, trying to do all of this work in 24 hours. And I wonder why we're not doing that, why we're building more temples instead of utilizing the temples that are already here for longer times, for a 24-hour span. So
I don't want to go at 3 a.m.
But if you felt like you were doing something very important or historical, we would do it. Totally. We would do it. Yep. And we could spend that money elsewhere. We could put that money elsewhere because, again, it's not a geographical need here the way that they've talked about it. And so that's my own. Concerning some of the international ones, I saw some reactions specifically to Iowa, to Edinburgh, and to Victoria, wondering there's just not enough members there to sustain a temple. Why would they put a temple there when there is at this point not enough members to sustain it? And even the similar question, is there enough members to staff it, to even open it for the members that are there? But then I also saw the question of why so many temples went through the online discourse. And I saw the gamut of reactions. I saw people saying, this is a little conspiracy theory, but like there's, these new particle accelerators and maybe they're bringing in the minions of Satan. And so we need to have these temples on the ground in order to combat all the minions of Satan that are coming in.
That's the reason. Okay. All right. Yeah.
I saw people wondering, as we're getting closer to the second coming, we just need to dot the earth with temples. And so we are obviously getting closer to the second coming. And so these temples are becoming more necessary. Then we kind of go more middle, wondering if it's more of a bet kind of a thing against the, hoping that the membership will be by that point that the temple is built, because we're pretty far out with a lot of temples, that there will be more members in that area by the time, and the temple will, fulfill a prophecy for that area. And then I also saw, again, from my understanding, these were all active members. So you kind of run the gamut, but the church has so much money. We've seen that in the news, and this is a place to put their money. Is this a place that they are investing in real estate as a safe place to put their money, kind of a thing, without having to do things with taxes or things like that? So those are some of the reactions that I saw to just the why so many temples.
Well, it's interesting. Elder Anderson specifically talked about, his framework was the reason why the church has been blessed with such enormous financial resources is to build temples. So it was less as a kind of investment, right? But like, this is why the church is so rich, so that we can do this, and it's necessary. And I heard a lot and sort of got the sense of that preparing for the second coming, a sense of refuge from the storm. A lot of talk of this is where you can find peace. This is where you can kind of escape from worldliness and from sin. And so for me, like, the language was less about leaning into the world and how to transform the world through humanitarian work and transforming communities and being peacemakers. We heard a lot more about thinking celestial than we did about being peacemakers. And so the temple, in one view, is a place to retreat from the world. Another way to think about it is that's where you're empowered to go out and live a life of Christian holiness in the world. But I heard a little bit more language of kind of retreat and refuge.
I guess some of the locations too play into this. The church have been pretty upfront that they've somewhat shifted their philosophy on temple building, and that they're looking at proximity for members, not necessarily at all the numbers that the members may have in a certain area, which may explain some of the temples going up, say in Europe, where maybe the church isn't growing, but members have had to travel a ways to get to a temple. Let's turn to a whole different topic, and it's one that wasn't highlighted much. Edward Dubé, a native of Zimbabwe, was elevated to the presidency of the 70, or he will be in August, I believe. He'll be the first black member, first member of African descent to reach that level of leadership. And this is a group that has increasingly come where they take apostles, where they name new apostles, especially in recent times. And he's 61 years old. We know that the leadership's, getting older up above him. So the chance of new apostles are coming. Is that, probably going to be coming? It doesn't mean Edward Dubé will be named an apostle, of course. But what do you think about that? Is this an important position, certainly within the structure of the church? Patrick?
Yeah, well, it was inevitable at some point with church growth in Africa and among, Afro-Brazilians and Caribbeans and so forth, that we would start to see people of African descent in these higher echelons of church leadership. Some might say it's taken longer than we might have expected. We're almost 50 years on from 1978. But I think this is just the harbinger of things to come. As you say, it might not mean anything about Elder Dubé himself in terms of a future call, but there will be more members of the church from Africa, from the Philippines. We see obviously the quorums of the 70 are full of people from Latin America, and we see Elder Suarez in the quorum of the 12. That's the future of the church in this century. Mm-hmm. We're just going to see more and more people from the global South in these senior leadership positions.
Emily, I'm going to ask you a specific question on that. What would the impact of naming a Black apostle have on the church?
I think it would be incredible. I think it would be very exciting. I think it could be a harbinger of, talking about some of the things that we have that are problematic in the church regarding race. I think there's just a lot. I brought up the chart of the general authorities that they just released a couple of weeks ago. And when I looked through it the first time, I was actually really heartened to see so many different members that, of color in the chart. And we have one in the primary presidency as well, a woman of color. And we're getting more diverse, and that's just a good thing.
Okay, we're going to wade back into a topic we've talked about a couple of times recently on Mormon land, and mainly because it was brought up again at conference. And Dallin Oaks and Sister Dennis addressed members and the wearing of garments. Why is this issue coming up now? And it's a very private practice, and to speak about it so publicly over the pulpit. Emily, I'll start with you.
I mean, everyone that I have talked to about this issue has answered, because we're not wearing them, because the members are no longer feeling the need to wear them continuously, or they define continuously. They define the way they wear garments in a different way than the leaders, I think, traditionally feel like is important. We saw that in the talks. We saw both Sister Dennis and President Oaks trying to both define more stringently the use and wearing of garments without specifically naming the times. I mean, Elder Oaks said the word obviously. You take them off at obvious times.
Yeah, I found that interesting too. Is it obvious to members?
I was curious if there would be a footnote with that statement, but no, there was not a footnote there, because, and I joke a little bit, but for men, maybe obvious would be to go play basketball in the church cultural hall. But for women to go exercise and do yoga, that's not obvious. And so, I mean, the delineations and definitions of garment wearing is really problematic. And again, I think in trying to study these talks in the next 6 months, we may get a confluence of more judgmental members of the church. I think that these talks do lend themselves to being able to do that. I know many people who have been garment checked by their leaders, by their family members, and I can see that getting much worse because of these talks. And I think that's unfortunate, because from what I can see from both of these talks and the theology of garments, it's very personal. It's a very personal thing and should not extend to other people.
Patrick, what's your take?
Yeah, it's interesting. In Sister Dennis's talk, actually, one of her footnotes specifically says we shouldn't judge other people on it, but it is in a footnote. I mean, she talks in the main text. It's that it is very personal. It's exactly what you just said, Emily. And then the footnote says we shouldn't judge other people for whether they're wearing or not wearing. I thought that the treatment of the topic by the two speakers was probably as good as we're going to get in terms of it. They weren't bringing the hammer. It wasn't really legalistic. I personally thought Sister Dennis's talk was quite good. I really liked the way that she framed it, and I thought was quite inviting. And I actually liked the way that President Oaks set it up in terms of thinking about in broader society, that the way that we make covenants and commitments to those kinds of things. So I thought they were. I thought they were thoughtful presentations of the topic. Obviously, people are going to respond to it differently based on their own feelings about this. But given how sensitive of a topic it is, I could imagine talks that were much harder to hear than what we heard.
I want to caveat that though with one thing that Elder Oaks said. He did say something to the effect. In fact, I can quote it. In contrast, persons who wear their garments faithfully and keep their temple covenants continually affirm their roles as disciples of the Lord Jesus Christ. Taking the negative version of that is that if you are not wearing your garments, you are not considered a disciple of Jesus Christ. Again, you could argue that he's not necessarily saying that, but I could see interpretations of it that you are not a disciple of Christ if you are not wearing garments. And that's not fair. That's not right. And it's problematic. And this wasn't gendered per se. Some of the things that was talked about before conference was more gendered, but there is a gendered component to the wearing of garments. And somebody on Twitter pointed this out, and I had never seen it. But when you go to purchase the garments on the church's website, if you look through the different types of garments, there are 75% of the types of garments say that they are not recommended for women with infections. And so they understand that the wearing of garments can be very problematic for, women at different times. And we can get into all the cultural differences as well, or, we get into heat. But garment wearing for women can be very difficult physically, mentally, actually, too, as well. So.
Yeah, it's a big topic. I think the gender difference generationally, there's big differences in terms of what it means. So Sister Dennis actually also one of her footnotes talks about the medical exemptions for the garments as well. So, but like you suggested, Emily, that some of that nuance may get lost in some Elders Quorum and Relief Society lessons.
I would say it will be interesting to see Frank with all those talks, but maybe particularly those two, how those play out at the congregational level. Last questions, and it's almost like a lightning round thing, but just two quick questions for each of you. I want you to just name what you liked least about the conference. We might know what Emily liked least, and what you liked most about the conference. So, Patrick, we'll start with you.
Okay. I already mentioned it. I thought that Elder Kieran's and Elder Holland's talks were particularly noteworthy, or at least they just resonated with me. I continue to be heartened by the ongoing focus on Jesus Christ and the centrality of his atonement. I think like that. We've arrived there. I mean, it is the Church of Jesus Christ. I was struck by that. This wasn't a conference about Joseph Smith or about some of those other things that we might have heard in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I'm heartened by that. I guess my concern or fear is a little bit what we were just talking about. As central as I think temples and covenants are to Latter-day Saint theology, they just are. They're inescapable. There's a way that talking about them can be used as a wedge and as a bludgeon, rather than as an invitation and as an expression of God's love. So I think it's a choice for each of us, for every member of the church, everybody who's teaching a lesson, everybody who's, sitting in a lesson. When we talk about covenants and when we talk about temples, how do we talk about them? I think we saw some great examples of ways that we can talk about them in really warm and inviting and compassionate ways. But there are other options as well that I hope we don't take.
Emily, your turn.
Again, Elder Karen was my favorite, but I had a second favorite just in case you asked this question.
Yes.
And it was Elder Rasband's talk, Words Matter. It was a very specific talk with some beautiful advice for how our words matter in speaking to those that we love, speaking online, speaking in any kind of place. And I was completely delighted by one of the footnotes where he defined what an emoji was.
Oh, really?
He said an emoji, often a little yellow face is a pictogram embedded in.
Did it have an emoji with it? Or
no, it was delightful. So I loved that. And I think that words do matter. Again, Elder Carpenter's talk should be struck from the record. I think it does too much damage for people who are in sealing situations that just don't match the church's ideal. And I think we should be, focusing on our happiness in the hereafter, but also focusing on our happiness now. And if you are considered sealed to someone that you consider is a monster and you feel like you have to keep that sealing, that's wrong. That is wrong. And you should not have to have that over your head. And that should be deleted. But the one other thing I wanted to bring up that I also do not like, and I think that we're in the middle of it, or maybe we're in the tail end of it. I have no idea. But I was curious this conference, how many times the speakers cited President Nelson? How many would you say? What would you guess, Dave?
I don't know. It seemed a little less to me this time, but maybe I'm wrong.
Oh, it didn't to me.
Oh, didn't it? I know it picked up pace Sunday. And matter of fact, one talk completely blew it out of the water. Yeah. So, yeah. How many?
I will say it was not 100, but it was 99.
Wow.
There was 99.
Met his age, huh? Okay.
Yeah. In the footnotes, which I thought was funny. It was his age. These are all his footnote citations. So this isn't counting the ones on the talk. These are just the sources that people cited him. And we are. That
doesn't mean they always named him, right?
No.
Okay. Okay. All right.
So these are his citations.
Although there were plenty of namings too, yes.
But I didn't count those namings. I just counted the sources. So if we put those together, we could have even gotten higher. And I feel like, again, going back to the question of, are they aging and we're not allowing them? There is this leader worship that is being promulgated in I don't know where, but it feels like everywhere to some extent. And I think that's wrong. I think we have to be really careful about that. And Hank Smith, a BYU religion professor, even tweeted this week that, we love President Nelson, although we don't worship him. Like, you had to add that he had to add that caveat because we're getting to that line, or maybe we're over that line. And I think that's both problematic on the members' part, as well as not fair for the leaders. And it's not what our church is about. We worship Christ.
Emily Jensen, Patrick Mason, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
And thanks to producer Nicole Weaver. We remind you that you can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Solid Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.